Okay. Hello and welcome to Amnesty International and Fight for the Future's fifth Salon on the implications of web3 and emerging technologies for human rights and activism. I'm Leah Holland, Campaigns and Communications Director with Fight for the Future. I use they or she pronouns and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. First, a couple of house rules for the chat. One, assume good intentions from those you're interacting with and our speakers. We're here to have a conversation and learn. Two, please treat folks with basic respect and decency. And three, no spam, but posting relevant resources is totally welcome. And panelists, I'll give you a 4-minute warning for your initial presentations, just to make sure we have a good portion of this event reserved for questions and conversation. And with that, I'll introduce our subject, privacy and the next generation internet. From blockchain to the prospect of government-backed digital cash to decentralization and more, our digital privacy is at the forefront of many of our minds as we face the reactionary rollback of abortion rights in the US. Today's internet is constantly leveraged to surveil and harm traditionally marginalized people who have been sounding the alarm on this issue for many years. We need vigorous engagement around how next generation technologies can meet or betray the promise of preserving our privacy and our rights. I'm so grateful to the panelists joining us today for a technically focused discussion of the hopes and challenges of that work. And with that, I'll hand the screen off to Michael Kleiman, Director of the Silicon Valley Initiative at Amnesty International.
Thank you all so much for joining. As Leah said, my name is Michael. I use he, him pronouns, and I lead Amnesty's work here in Silicon Valley, focusing on the human rights implications of technology for better or for worse. We are all increasingly aware of the privacy risks associated with today's internet, and particularly the surveillance capitalism business model used by platforms like Facebook, in which we pay for free services provided by companies in exchange for ever more of our personal data. The three in Web3 serves a number of purposes. First, it implies a specific historical view of how the web evolved from an initial state of an open internet or more open internet in the 90s and early 2000s, Web 1, towards ever greater corporate centralization and power, leading to the dominance of a handful of big tech corporations today, Web 2. Second, it posits Web 3 as the next step in this evolution towards a more decentralized future in which our online experience is not shaped or not only shaped by these companies. A quick terminology note, the Web 3 I'm using here in a lazy sense, but it's in some ways a very loaded term. And so using other terminology, next generation internet, distributed web, also in these contexts makes sense. That said, whatever we want to call what's coming, it's not necessarily a panacea. The only way to create rights-respecting technology, including technology that is privacy protecting, is to do so deliberately with a clear sense of the potential trade-offs and risks. And with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our amazing panelists. Today, we'll hear from three speakers. Aditya Bharadwaj, lead developer of the Zcash wallet Nighthawk. Jay Stanley, Senior Policy Analyst with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, and Dan Ballard, Director of Engineering, Open Privacy Research Society. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have an extended Q&A. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat, and as Leah said, always assume good intentions. And with that, Aditya, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Let me just share my screen here. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Right. So thanks for inviting me to discuss the implications of privacy for human rights. Web3 and decentralized technologies have given us a multitude of opportunities to connect with like-minded communities around the world and work towards a cause. It is possible to assemble virtually, pay for services like VPN and email with cryptocurrency, and even reward community members with tokens or NFTs to build a movement. However, Web3 users need to ask, how much of our freedoms are we giving up on the way? So the Constitution DAO raised millions of dollars to buy a copy of the US Constitution, but lost out on the auction because their total buying power was known to the competing bidders. The DAO would have benefited by keeping the total buying power private. The ENS system in Ethereum enables active surveillance of accounts. Few understand the repercussions of having their financial history public. The Canadian truckers' protests saw Bitcoin used as an alternative to donating money after the centralized payment processors refused to service donors exercising their right to protest. Some of the Bitcoin donations ended up in the hands of the protesters, while the majority of the funds were blacklisted and seized by intermediaries. What's worse is that Bitcoin and other transparent coin donors had their transactions broadcasted and saved on an irreversible public ledger. This information can be used in the future to tie donors with their past actions and result in further fallout. Blockchain privacy is not intuitive. Cryptocurrencies broadcast transactions to everyone. While it may be possible to obscure data to passive observers, users need privacy from who they send the payments to and who pays them. Simply hiding transaction value or IP addresses isn't enough. There is a need to hide the transaction graph to attain privacy. So cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum are fully transparent, but they leak your balance, transaction history, and transaction graph when you make a single transaction with a counterparty. These technologies are decentralized and give users control over their digital property, but fail to provide any level of privacy. There are decoy technologies available today like CoinJoin and Mimblewimble that consist of decoy sampled from current transactions of the user, or RingCT with decoys sampled from all of user transaction history that tries to obscure the transaction graph. But repeated transaction with vendors result in added risk to forward secrecy, and it leaks the user's transaction graph. It is important to understand that you need to start from privacy, that privacy cannot be added in flight, as the advanced systems easily detect incoming amounts and match outgoing transactions to reveal the senders and recipients. Shielded transactions, as seen in Zcash, provide private transactions that have no visible linkages and eliminates transaction graph. Additionally, Zcash gives users the right to selective disclosure. For example, a charity can make public their incoming donations with viewing keys and still have privacy for their expenses. For Nighthawk wallet that we built, we targeted a privacy-first approach to the best extent possible. We did not request any unnecessary information from users during onboarding. We said no to analytics software, no dependencies on external App Store APIs, and by default, only connected to servers that come with a signed warranty canary from the operators to confirm that the servers are not being actively surveilled. We made the app available on FOSS supporting F-Droid App Store, and we worked with volunteers to initially set up the operations and applied for funding from the Zcash community instead of venture capitalists for incentivizing developers and putting the users first. VC funding risks getting dried up during bear markets or might end up requiring the censorship of users, like we saw the Infura, which is used by the Ethereum wallet MetaMask, which ended up censoring the entire Venezuelan citizens last year. So we know that switching to HTTPS helped unlock trillions of dollars of economic activity online. The same way, switching to shielded transactions in Web3 could enable traditional products in finance, medical, compliance, and more to empower humans with both control and privacy over their data. Zcash has solved privacy for cryptocurrencies by using zero-knowledge proofs. Users get the full protection of their wallet balances and transactional history when using shielded addresses to transact ZEC. But there's more to be done. Today, we rely on the Tor project for network-level privacy, and it would be good to see more widespread network-level privacy options with the efforts of NIM Network, Meson project, and other advanced algorithms to retrieve and broadcast information privately. And as for awareness and privacy rights, Web3 users are so used to leaking their information on a regular basis that even the discussions around privacy solutions make some wonder if it's legal to have privacy. This needs to change. So when considering the information leaks that are possible in Web3, we must demand more from our builders of these Web3 technologies. Otherwise, we end up falling back to the surveillance state. With that, I wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we will hear from Jay Stanley with ACLU.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be participating in this. So I'm going to talk about digital money, visions for Web3 insofar as they involve purchases and other financial transactions are going to need digital currency. And one of the questions is what that currency is going to look like and how private will it be? Cryptocurrency, of course, is at the heart of a lot of people's vision for Web3 since, like Web3, it's based on the blockchain. But there's not really any real reason that other uses of the blockchain, like for file storage or asset registration or whatever else is invented for blockchain, in hopefully carrying out this vision of a new internet architecture that decentralizes and disempowers the centralized companies that are invading our privacy so much. There's no reason that just because those other users use the blockchain that the currency also needs to use the blockchain. And in fact, there's good reasons to think that crypto is probably not the best tool for the job. The biggest cryptocurrencies fluctuate wildly in value. They're in danger potentially of financial collapse. Nobody quite knows how big that danger is. They're inefficient at processing transactions. They're inaccessible technology-wise to most people. They're inelastic in that the money supply can't be expanded and contracted, and the privacy is questionable, as Aditya was just talking about. And so I think that's why there's a lot of conversation that's happening right now about creating a government digital currency. There's clearly a need for digital currencies. We use credit cards for all kinds of things. We use things like, digital transaction thing. I'm blanking on the name of the app, but Venmo. We use things like Venmo and so forth. But the privacy is terrible in all of these things. And there are also high fees involved. And so, at the ACLU, we generally support decentralization of technology and decentralization of power. But just because the decentralization that the Web3 vision promises is a good thing, doesn't necessarily mean that decentralized money is necessarily a good thing or private currency. We had private currencies before the Civil War. They were banknotes. They were issued by banks. The government didn't issue its own currency. And they had a lot of the same problems that we see with cryptocurrencies: unstable in value, vulnerable to financial panics and bank runs and collapse. And the creation of a government currency, greenbacks, physical dollars during the Civil War solved a lot of these problems. And so there's a lot of conversation now about, do we need a government digital currency given the amount of demand there is for digital currencies? There was a centralized issuer of cash, the US government, but the cash itself, of course, is very decentralized. If you think about it, cash has an amazing set of qualities. It's universally accessible, universally accepted, relatively stable in value, no transaction fees, permissionless. Nobody tells me that I can't give you $100. And it lends itself to privacy and anonymity. So as a first principle at the ACLU, we think we need to preserve cash as an option for people. And that means ban on cashless stores, which you've already seen passed in cities like New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and also New Jersey and Massachusetts. We're definitely going to need digital currency. So insofar as there's a lot of discussion around the world about creating what are called CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies issued by the Federal Reserve or other digital currencies, the big question, of course, is privacy. Nobody wants a world in which every time you pay a kid, $15 to mow your lawn, or you give a friend money for a beer or weed or whatever, that there's a government record of that. And so the question is, can we have a digital public good digital currency that preserves some of these cash-like qualities, especially privacy and permissionless? And there's two, and I'm going to conclude, there's two basic ways of doing that. One is a proposal that we've seen in something called the eCash Act, proposed in Congress, sponsored by Rep. Stephen Lynch, Massachusetts. It would actually create a bearer instrument. So you would have digital cash in your smart card that you possess or in your phone, and you could send it directly to somebody else's phone, and there would be no ledger, no centralized tracking. And so by architecture, it would be very privacy preserving. And if you lose your smart card, you're out of luck. You lose your money, just like if you lose a wad of cash. And then there are, however, questions about whether that can be done cryptographically, whether that can be secured against adversaries, including people with electron microscopes who might crack into these smart cards and so forth. And obviously, it won't work if that can happen. The other potential way of doing this is with a ledger-based system with zero knowledge proofs and other technology similar to what we've heard about Zcash. There are a lot of questions. I'm not a cryptographer. I know that the cryptographers who work with Zcash are very well respected, and I think that if the government is going to create some sort of a digital public currency, then it must use, to the greatest extent possible, whatever privacy protecting technologies are available and that are effective. And there will have to be exploration by the technology community about what that looks like exactly, but there's no reason that the government shouldn't take advantage of all existing and proven technologies when they create that kind of a system. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. And Dan, why don't you go ahead and wrap up our presentations? Dan, I don't have audio for you. We can troubleshoot. I'll tell. Okay, I just heard something.
Can you hear me now?
It's a little fuzzy. Are you not plugged in all the way or something?
Should be. Is it still not working?
I think it just needs to be closer to your lips, maybe.
Hello?
There you go. Great.
Okay. Got it now? Yeah. Hi, I'm Dan Ballard, Director of Engineering at the Open Privacy Research Society. We research and develop software. We're a nonprofit. My pronouns are he, him. So let me tell you a bit more about open privacy. We have 3 core tenets, the first of which is about decentralizing control. The focus of that is that technology should prioritize anti-surveillance and consent, that no one party should be able to exert power over a whole system. Our second tenet is designed for the margins. It is vital to understand the risk faced by underrepresented, persecuted, or victimized communities. Only through that understanding can we build systems that empower rather than oppress. And finally, our third tenet is that privacy through transparency. The only way to build robust systems is to open them up to the world. Process and protocol should be documented and free for anyone to inspect and comment on. All that is to say that our main project for the last 4 years has been a metadata-resistant, privacy-preserving, peer-to-peer messaging app called Kuch, which is a Welsh word that translates to a hug that creates a safe space. So web3, as has been mentioned, is often considered more synonymous with blockchain tech, but it is a much broader term that is describing sort of this trend of decentralizing power, especially away from centralized social media hubs that were built in the wave of Web 2.0. It's very much a reaction in some ways to Web 2.0. Kuch, as an example, is a peer-to-peer decentralized messaging system that works over Tor and doesn't have a blockchain component. So it has different privacy and networking and other properties than blockchain tech. They share the lack of centralized control, but without a blockchain, there is no one Kuch network. Instead, it's just a lot of peers interacting with each other in smaller ad hoc and decentralized networks with no central record of activity, identity, or any metadata. There are lots of examples of earlier and very successful decentralized tech from previous generations. In the early 2000s, we saw BitTorrent launch to huge success, and it's a great example of the swarming power decentralized technology can bring. And also, to a lesser extent, a decent example of a technology that can, in some cases, circumvent censorship. But on the other hand, it provides very little privacy. Original Skype was actually another amazing example of decentralized engineering. It was a very decentralized app with the company itself only really requiring to run a small set of servers to manage billing. The calls themselves were dynamically routed across the network of users with no centralization. This did actually provide some privacy to users of Skype because it made it very hard for authorities to tap. Sadly, years later, Microsoft did buy Skype, and the first thing they did was rip out all of this efficient, low cost to run, scalable, and user privacy preserving distributed architecture and replace it with a more traditional centralized system. When we were starting open privacy, we were very aware of the risks of being a for-profit startup or a corporation that it could have for our users long term, from either investors or venture capitalists asking us to compromise privacy to harvest data, or eventually to being purchased and having what happened to Skype happen to our software users. This led us to form Open Privacy as a non-for-profit and to do all our work as open source so that we'll never have to deal with conflicting motivations and that our software will always be available in its best working form to users, even if we go away. More broadly, I think this shows and means that decentralized aspects of the Web3 movement are fantastic and can be key ingredients in a new generation of privacy-focused software for users. Decentralization offers many pros when designing systems. It's a systems design practice with a long, rich history, with lots of established knowledge to draw from. It's only sad that we often see it discarded as a design practice or left unconsidered by many companies when they're building new systems because it would make it harder for them to monetize their users and their data. If, as an organization, privacy is of the utmost importance to you, then you need to think carefully about the software you're using, from its design and implementation all the way to the supplier of it. It takes more than just distributed design to preserve privacy. There is nothing inherent in decentralized design or Web3 that is privacy focused or providing on its own. We at Open Privacy focus specifically on privacy in our design work and also employ other relevant design practices such as consentful design. Because of this, we are already seeing some exciting examples of early adoption by Kutch by folks with incredibly strong privacy needs. I'm excited to start diving into some of the topics with the panel.
Great. All right, well, we'll go ahead and transition to a Q&A. Should anybody else have questions for these folks, please feel free to post them and we'll get to as many as we can. We already have a pretty good list going here, so I will dive right in. Let's see. So Dan, I'll just go ahead and start with you. I'm wondering what some of the practices that you recommend for projects to engage and assess their impact on marginalized people might be.
So talking to the communities is a big thing, engaging with them. For us, which is still in fairly early phases of development and research and design, we're still building building blocks. We have messaging working, but we have a lot more we want to build. Before the pandemic, we'd gotten some funding and started to plan doing some consultation with communities and in-person interviews to preserve privacy, but the pandemic made a lot of that impossible at the time and had to be postponed. But yeah, basically, if you want to work with marginalized communities, start engaging them, spend the money, reach out, talk to people, start actually gathering data. There's lots of practices in the security field, from things like threat modeling and other things you can do to start understanding your users' actual needs and use cases and better address them. And then from a much more general perspective of design practices, there's several sort of more broad design practices you can employ, from consentful design to local first design. And yeah, these are all just sort of very broad tools that you can use when designing software.
As a follow-up question for Dan and Aditya, as you're engaging with communities and users, what has surprised you about the feedback that you've received in terms of what issues concern users that you would not have expected? Also, any ways in which their definition of privacy might differ from yours? Let's go Aditya and Dan on that one.
Sure. As a mobile app developer, of course, there's a lot of feedback from the users about what they expect, like the app should do these features and maybe the app should support those services. So it seems like most users are still not aware of how much they are giving up when they add dependency on third-party services, right? Like even if you want to show a price feed in your application, you are leaking your IP address every time you open the app. And that just adds to, there are many smart ways the companies like chain analysis and surveillance companies know how to track users. So there has to be a balance found into how to get these information that the users want and still preserve their privacy. So it's just surprising that people don't understand what they're leaking out.
So some of the research that led to the founding of Open Privacy was done by one of our other founders, Sarah Jamie Lewis, and she built a piece of software called Onion Scan. Partly as part of this research, her original thesis was that let's see what maybe the cutting edge of anonymity protection tech might look like. Let's go looking for people with a lot of skin in the game with high stakes. So maybe black market drug sites might showcase some interesting tech. But unfortunately, we found that actually it's just a lot of people trying to make some money with not very much technical skills. And there was actually a lot of risk going on. Some of the early sites didn't have almost anything in the way of privacy preserving features for the users. So simple things that you see more of now, like pictures taken with your phone have EXIF data embedded in them, which by default often includes GPS coordinates of where the photo was taken. So some of the early drug sites you were seeing, like an eBay for drugs, you'd see a picture of like a bunch of drugs, and if you examined the image file, you'd find GPS coordinates for the person's house. So in a lot of cases, people are just trying to get by to make money, and they are just trying to use whatever's available. And a lot of times, the current available tech isn't as good as they would hope or need.
Yep, that is disturbing. Jay, next one's for you. Going off a piece that you've written about efforts to eliminate cash itself, moving power away from big tech and big banks, other entrenched institutions with a lot of power, seems like an existential threat to those institutions. If that's the case, how are we seeing their efforts to maintain their control manifest in these conversations? And if anybody has anything to add after Jay, feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the chat, there is a concerted sort of effort. There is a war on cash that is not just events unfolding sort of in the free marketplace, reflecting the aggregate desires of consumers. There are top-down efforts by the credit card companies and other big companies to push digital cash on us. I mean, I never chose to not be able to pay with cash when I'm on an airplane. I was just told that I can't buy anything with cash when I'm on an airplane. And we see that in many sectors across society. The credit card companies are actually giving $10,000, bonuses to some small hip stores if they agree to stop accepting cash and so forth. And the credit card companies charge enormous fees. A small store will often pay more in fees to the credit card companies than they make in profits in a year, and they are likely to oppose the kind of proposals like that by Rep. Lynch, the eCash Act, that that would undo their sitting pretty. And I mean, can you imagine if you had a 1% to 3% national sales tax, how much money that would bring in? I mean, that's what the credit cards charge in this country, and it's far out of proportion to the value of the service that they provide, which can't be that hard in today's day. And so it's going to be a fight. One possibility is that some sort of private solution like Zcash becomes dominant. I think that Zcash looks like, I haven't investigated it closely, but it seems to be a very, and other privacy protecting cryptocurrencies seem very promising. But you could also have the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department issue a government issued digital currency that becomes a public good rather than a private good as a money. And that in many ways is the most promising direction. The question is whether the Federal Reserve is going to bend to the will of the commercial banks that it is very tightly bound with, and within the security agencies who are going to want there to not be privacy and anonymity in transactions. And so, that's the battle. And There's no question that it will probably be a tough battle given the wealth and the power of the companies, but you have to first start with a vision, like, and what you need to demand. And I don't think that Americans want any kind of a government currency that keeps records of their transactions. I think that's true among progressives. I think that's true among conservatives. And so I think it will be a fight, but it will be one that is possible to win.
Aditya?
So beyond just the tracking that might come with these digital cash run by governments or centralized companies, it's the power given to them to set the rules. So the thing that I worry about is the cash that we have in our digital card and smart cards might come with an expiry, or you may be subject to just blocking, like you may be blocked from spending your cash, even by mistake, on a blanket ban. So that's very risky. And we have seen it in some other countries, like a few years back when India banned the specific banknotes. Many people actually died because they couldn't get to the hospital and pay their bills. So it does have huge repercussions. Again, they have to be thought of who's setting the rules and what does it result in.
And I jump in and make one more quick point, which is that one of the political obstacles to coming up with some sort of a currency that protects privacy is the fact that nobody really wants Russian oligarchs or American oligarchs, for that matter, to be able to shoot hundreds of millions of dollars around the world with absolutely no accountability, no traceability, to evade taxes for whatever other bad reasons. I mean, for me, privacy is about protecting ordinary people and vulnerable people. And people who can zip tens of millions of dollars around the world can, they can take care of themselves when it comes to their privacy and everything else. But you're going to hear warnings that if you have a truly anonymous currency, that we're going to see, oligarchs being able to do whatever they want without any accountability, that you're going to see assassination marketplaces online and things like that. And so I think that one of the promises in some of this cryptography is that you can actually have systems that protect privacy for small amounts, but do allow, as a cryptographic matter, larger amounts to be revealed. And the bearer instrument proposal would allow limits on the amount of cash that each device could hold. And so that's part of the game and part of the conversation here is there any kind of limit in the amounts that would be transmissible with privacy?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Okay. So the other side of this is that, as Jay said, the oligarchs and so forth and rich folk are very able to sort of do whatever they want with their money, no matter what. They're very protected. I find that argument very common, but somewhat frustrating, because the folks we actually see continually being subjected to financial censorship are usually marginalized communities. We've seen a huge wave of that against the sex worker community emanating from the US over the last few years with the FOSTA and SESTA Act. Successive waves of support technology and websites have fallen offline and been removed. Backpages had to completely just stop being a company and go offline. Craigslist personals had to be removed from the site. And these are services that have a real impact. There was a study done about female homicide rates in cities where Craigslist personals launched. And it wasn't just that sex worker homicides went down. They found on average in a city where Craigslist personals launched that female homicides dropped by 20%. And that's just, again, Craigslist personals, not Backpages, not other support sites. So when these acts passed, those sites went away, and then successively we're seeing increasing financial pressure from now credit card companies against other corporations. Like last year, we saw OnlyFans almost have to ban anyone providing anything remotely like sex work, or else they were going to lose the ability to process payments. So everyone always worries about the ultra rich getting away with more crime, but we continually are seeing marginalized communities suffer right now. So it's a hard and difficult discussion to sort of try and reframe with folks. Thanks.
And I agree with everything you said. I'm just pointing out that that is a political obstacle, this idea of the oligarchs and giant drug dealers and so forth. And if you can come up with a technological solution that allows for ironclad cryptographic privacy for ordinary people, while allowing that to be defeated for very large amounts, as some cryptographers have said is possible, then that would eliminate that political problem to what would solve the problems that you're talking about.
So everything involves trade-offs, and we just talked about one potential trade-off around the benefits of anonymity and yet potentially some of the costs incurred. What are some of the other framings around the potential problems with privacy respecting currency that you find really frustrating? So one sort of criticism is that it enables a level of criminality. What are some of the other critiques that you often hear, and how would you respond to them?
So one thing I hear a lot of times is that people who use private currencies will not pay taxes and the government will lose out. So this is again incorrect, I believe. I think the currency is just a tool, and rest of the legal regulations do apply for all the participants in a specific economy. Everyone is needed to file their taxes and file and report their business income and private income. So rest of the operations should go on as today. It's just we are replacing the tool with something that is more digital, unless someone has better response to the tax issue.
I think that there's an insidious idea that in transitioning from paper cash to digital money, that we should be able to solve all problems like tax evasion in that process. And I think that we should set our expectations more reasonably, more realistically. I think law enforcement, everything, they want to toss privacy overboard in order to grab all these other benefits, like 100% tax compliance and so forth. But people evaded taxes with paper cash, and they should be able to do so with a cash-like digital privacy too. And that law enforcement has plenty of tools. It's a golden age of law enforcement surveillance by which to track down people who are engaged in crime. And trying to throw privacy overboard in the transition to digital currency in order to try to sort of stop crime is not the right trade-off. And in terms of sort of things that people object to when it comes to digital cash, I would say that one of them is that it would disrupt existing companies and so forth. And to me, that is a feature and not a bug.
I'll just tack on that. I think the tax argument could be an entire separate discussion. There's a lot of ways of doing taxation. A lot of governments have sort of focused on taxing at the spending of currency, but you can do wealth taxes when people earn it. You can lean heavily on property taxes or taxing things that people own. It doesn't have to be just around the spending of currency. There's a lot of broader discussion about how we could change taxation to handle it. I think people just like to fall back on cryptocurrency might, or privacy currency in general, might make it harder to do just what we're doing, whether or not we should be doing it this way moving forward. So let's not. That's, I think, a poor argument.
So another issue I see brought up is the economics angle itself. Like cryptocurrencies are known for inserting a capped supply, somewhat choosing a deflationary model, but some economics folks really argue for an inflationary model, which is in control in response to how the economy is doing. So I personally prefer the deflationary model, just being in the crypto space for a while, but I'm sure there are strong arguments for the economic theories to play out.
Okay, let's see, another question. Switching gears a little bit, this is more of a messaging one for anybody who wants to chime in. I'm wondering if you have thoughts or ideas about how we can push back against this cultural trend of wondering if privacy is legal amongst lay people. That is incredibly concerning, and often those cultural perceptions lead to changes, in policy and expectations amongst everyone. So what can we do to ameliorate that?
Sorry, was the question, is privacy legal for lay people, or?
Aditya mentioned at the top that there's this increasing trend of wondering if privacy is legal among lay people, crypto users, et cetera. And I'm wondering how we might push back against that trend of uncertainty about whether privacy is or should be a right.
I'm sure I can just offer a quick few experiences or anecdotes. I've definitely seen a lot of people who go with the argument, I have nothing to hide, so I don't need it. I've definitely encountered a lot of people in my work who feel they're comfy giving up their privacy right now because they think it might stop crime. And that's generally been proven not to be the case. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much they might need their privacy later. And it's definitely a common argument, and I don't have a huge set of good rebuttals yet.
I mean, one issue is that, there are complex know your customer and anti-money laundering laws that do make privacy illegal at certain amounts and in certain respects. And I'm not an expert in these complicated financial laws, but if you pay a plumber more than $10,000 in cash, that plumber is required to file a report with the authorities, and basically anybody who who engaged in a transaction of more than $10,000 is supposed to report it. So there's no privacy for a cash transaction over $10,000. That $10,000 limit, by the way, was passed in 1972 and was not indexed to inflation. So it was about the equivalent, I think, like 30,000 today, and it should be indexed to inflation. I do think that there can be a very pernicious cultural expectation that anybody who is, for example, exercising their privacy must have something to hide, which is the flip side of what Dan just mentioned. And I think that, so for example, like, why would you use an encrypted program if you don't have anything to hide? You must be and I think we can help erode that by using encrypted programs, by using privacy protecting software and other things, even if we don't feel like we need it all the time, because when you do need it, you don't want to stick out. I wrote a piece about what's wrong with the I have nothing to hide, so why should I care thing. I put that in the chat, but there's a lot of rebuttals to it. But I think that, making use of privacy protecting technologies, even when you don't need them, is one way that you can help.
I think one of the challenges that a lot of people face when confronted with crypto, Web3, distributed web, even people who understand the privacy implications, is that it can be hard for someone who's not steeped in this space to distinguish between worthwhile projects and those that are more problematic. And I was wondering, from all three of you, what are red flags that people who want to engage in this space or want to potentially use Web3 apps or products, what are red flags that you guys use to say, all right, this might be problematic? Like, how do you distinguish between what you would consider sort of legit privacy protecting approaches and those that are not so?
I mean, we've seen snake oil products in the security and privacy community for many, many years. And the basic fact is that security and privacy are very hard. And so one red flag is if a company proclaims that they have a proprietary security system or proprietary encryption system, which means that they built it themselves. And the most secure things are the ones that have been published and made public and have been vetted by many cryptographers and academics, and that are widely understood around the communities as being good. What I do is I look towards larger conversations. If it's some company I've never heard of, it might be the best company in the world, but I'm not going to trust it until I hear from respectable sources whether various cryptography experts, Edward Snowden, and many others, that that they think that it's good, and that it's also that it's been around a while and it's been able to be tested, and people have tried to attack it and failed, and that a company is reputable and not likely full of scam artists.
So this gets back to some of the talk about picking the right provider I was mentioning. Generally, any for-profit company is going to have some tension about how they monetize user data. So definitely nonprofits or open source projects are already probably less internally at odds with the goals of strongly protecting user privacy. And as Jay was saying, anything that's open source and can be actually peer reviewed is a huge step forward. Open Privacy has participated in this. A few years ago, Switzerland was looking at adopting a electronic voting system, and one of the late stages of evaluating it published the source code. And our co-founder, Sarah Jamie Lewis, spent a few months poring over it with a few other academics, and they published 2 papers on how the e-voting system didn't actually deliver on its promised goals. And it was hard technical work. It was mathematicians and a computer scientist working together, because the math on paper looked good. The code was a lot messier, and that was already a warning sign. But the real problem was that, well, the code itself might have been okay. It didn't actually do everything the math spelled out. There was a few missing steps that would basically allow someone to potentially influence the vote, inject some votes, and still have the system then turn around and say, I haven't been tampered with, everything's fine. So in the end, after the papers came out, Switzerland chose not to go forward with that e-voting system for their federal elections. So.
And one of the red flag I'll point out is some people might just recommend that these technologies are used in the dark net markets, and that's why they are the safest. That's not always true. Like even Dan had brought up the issues earlier. So maybe pay attention to the builders behind the project, how well versed they are in their field. Like much of this cryptography is bleeding edge. It's still not out in the field for many years. We have to look at security audits by multiple firms, and then maybe try the waters and test the waters.
Great. Yeah. And one other thought that I would add is that I often ask myself, what tools are journalists using? Because they are often thinking about this and informed at a level that it's hard to get otherwise. And so piggybacking, Paul in the chat, Dan asked, I gather that you see a lack of privacy protection in existing P2P messaging technologies like DID-COM and libp2p, things like that. I don't know if that fits into this question, but I wanted to make sure to get Dan's question answered, or sorry, Paul's question answered.
I haven't looked at either of those too closely, but generally when looking for something you want to start with is privacy a core tenet of whoever is offering it. And I'm not sure if either of those projects are saying like privacy is one of their first core tenets. Just because something's P2P and uses, say, encryption doesn't mean it can't still generate metadata. Or on the other hand, maybe it's just lacking features. Like this is something we're still in active research around. We have good just peer-to-peer, one person to one person messaging with no metadata for its security, a lot of good guarantees. But once you start trying to do group messaging, it's much harder in this kind of setting where you still want to make it secure and non-metadata generating. So we're still in active research about best ways to do that. It is definitely not a solved problem. So with those projects, I don't know one way or the other what they're either promising or what they're delivering. So I couldn't say.
This is a question for all 3 panelists, which is, what is the one thing that you would like, that each of you would like participants and those listening to take away from this conversation around sort of privacy and the distributed web, or privacy in Web3? Why don't we go just alphabetical order by first name? So Aditya, Dan, and then Jay.
Sure. So on a very high level, most of the users today are being messaged by the top companies like Facebook, Google, with the social media apps they control, about what is okay, what is not okay. So there has to be a further understanding and reading that is expected to be done by the users. I know it's difficult because people are just used to getting these apps for the first time, buying their first smartphone and just using the technology. But soon they will learn after using the technology and running into mishaps that there is something not right, what we have been messaged by these applications. And we need some change, and we need to demand some change as users.
I would just hope that more people are able to develop, as we go forward in time, better thinking around evaluating software, and that, like with previous things like centralized solutions, there's a wide variety of potential privacy guarantees available, but it generally comes down to something completely separate than whether it's Web3 or distributed or centralized. Is the provider focused on privacy? We see this with Signal. They are a centralized service, but they center privacy in their offering. And they're currently one of the better offerings that a lot of people can easily get their hands on and use. But they're still a centralized service, and that's okay. It's more about what are the focuses and commitments of your software provider, not just necessarily any specific underlying piece of technology.
I guess I would say, that if we're going to have a new, we need to pay attention to currency and how it's architected and what will be the digital currency that is used in Web3. And then I guess I'd make another point, which hasn't been made in the conversation, but I think that, it would be great if we have a new internet architecture, new architectures for money and for storage, for lots of things that are more inherently privacy preserving. I don't think that we should put all of our hopes into new architectures, and that we also need good privacy protections, good privacy laws and rules. And we need to fight for that, even as we also put our hopes in and try and work towards new actual, technological infrastructures that will also protect privacy.
All that is so helpful. Thank you. Let's see. At my org, Fight for the Future, we're pretty concerned and forward-looking in terms of digital currencies in particular, and think that it's important for ourselves and other activists in the space who care about privacy to be actively engaging and keeping up to date with what's happening around a CBDC or digital cash in whatever country they're in, countries around the world. So I'm wondering if y'all can recommend some of the best conversations that are happening around digital currency. Where are you going for your information? A place that's accessible to lay folks who may not be so technically inclined. Who are you listening to around this to keep on it?
So for my best source is my Twitter folks I follow. I follow the industry leaders who are working with the banks and governments as well, like the founders of Circle, Jeremy Allaire, I believe. And then from there, you can follow all the other top folks who are talking and debating about CBDCs. So Twitter and direct link from the folks themselves is the best bet. And of course, after that, you got to go in deep, read the research papers published by academicians, PhDs. So there's a lot of in-depth analysis that can be done.
I think that some of the real thought leaders on this space include Rohan Gray, Raul Carrillo, and Robert Hockett, who've written some really interesting things and have been really leading the thinking around what a digital currency should look like, especially a public government digital currency.
I'm the same as Aditya. I get what I get mostly from Twitter.
Great. And I see that we are basically at time. Leah, do you have a final question? If not, I think we can wrap things up.
I would maybe sneak in one more real quick. What is the biggest misconception y'all think that people have re Web3 and privacy in particular? What do you see out there that really bugs you that's not true?
So, or maybe the Web3 technologies are so easy. Like, let's talk, for example, like NFT mint. Someone wants to take part in an NFT minting, they want to buy NFTs. Just because they didn't provide their personal information, they believe everything is private. So that's a big misconception, because the moment you interact with a transparent Web3 protocol, you give up a lot of information about yourselves.
Yeah, I'd say the same. Just a lot of it's the same as we've seen before. Sort of lack of technical literacy leading people sort of hoping that the new thing provides more than it does, and even some people working on it occasionally saying just because it is decentralized and not in the hands of one single megacorp, the data is just a smidge harder to gather, that it provides privacy, but that's provably not the case. There's lots of systems out there that are perfectly fine at hoovering up all of this just lightly distributed data and building a very strong record of actions for their own use.
Yeah, and I would have said the same thing. And I guess I would just, in order just to not say the same thing, I would say, the idea that, because something is decentralized, it's going to stay that way, which I know has been a big part of the conversations here, but the threat of re-centralization, because as Moxie Marlin Spike put it, nobody wants to build their own servers. We have decentralized technologies like email and the web, and yet they have been re-centralized into Gmail and Facebook. Because people are too lazy to, set up their own servers, even though they can in theory. And the question of whether that will happen again with the new architectures and meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Guys, thank you all so much for an incredible and incredibly informative panel. This is recorded. We will make the recording available. I have to say, this was actually we've done a large number of these, and this is one of my absolute favorites, and I learned a lot. And so just a tremendous thank you to the panelists and for everyone who attended and listened and submitted questions. And as always, a massive thank you to Leah and Fight for the Future for leading on all of this.
Fantastic. Awesome. I think with that, we'll wrap. And